going to introduce the next session, which is data tools to tackle misinformation. And this is really going to be looking at tracking, detecting, reporting on misinformation, including some of the tools that you can use in your toolbox to do that. And for this session, I'm going to introduce Joe Lukito, who is an assistant professor at the School of Journalism and Media here, and she is also a senior faculty research associate with the Center for Media Engagement. She looks at, in her research, cross-platform media languages in the global political communication context, and she specifically focuses on the interaction between news and different social media platforms. Dr. Lukito specializes in natural language processing and quantitative language analysis methods. So she's going to be talking to you about some of those tools that you may be able to apply. She also teaches, co-teaches with Christian McDonald data journalism class in our journalism school. So Christian McDonald is a professor in our journalism, our School of Journalism and Media. He has been teaching with us while he was working as a journalist, and then he came to us full-time. He was at the Austin American-Statesman, where he worked with reporters and editors throughout the newsroom to do data journalism and using some of the tools we're going to be talking about today. He also helped conceive and build the Statesman's Longhorn Sports vertical, Hookem.com. He led many digital projects from the beginning of the Statesman going online to running the software development group for the business side. And he's won many awards for this work. So I would invite you to welcome both of them for their session with a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Gina, and thanks for that lovely introduction. So as Gina noted, this Christian, Joe, we both teach reporting with data, which is kind of data journalism. A lot of this involves teaching students how to use programming languages such as R and Python in order to conduct or write journalism stories and to find stories within the data. But for this particular workshop, we're not going to be talking so much about code. We'll be talking a little bit more about data tools you can actively use in your newsrooms tomorrow.
But part of that is we do want to talk about how the tools are like a gateway drug to doing more, in a sense that they're approachable and allow you to start digging deeper. And this is not just with misinformation, but with journalism in general. There's so many sources of data in today's world that lead to stories. I mean, our data isn't really numbers and zeros, it's a representation of life in some form or another. So we'll often use the data in order to find the people to tell the stories about. And that is just as true here. And so with these tools, it's like you get familiarity, but as we go through this, think about how you can build that on a larger scale. And by learning programming languages like R and Python, you can take that, do more, and do work that couldn't otherwise be done. One of my mentors through life was someone named Sean McIntosh at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and her team of data journalists and producers, she says, I want to do journalism that would not be otherwise done without programming. And they've proven it time and again. So that's part of what Joe and I are trying to instill in our young journalists. So we don't start with Excel. We don't even do it. We start with R. And that is a challenge for many of them, but they learn and get through it, and it's also something that you can continue to learn on easily. I won't say easily, but there's so many resources out there to keep building and programming skills. When it comes to misinformation, this is Joe's show. Let me be no qualms about this. I'm here to help as folks need it as we walk through a couple little quick demos. But this is Joe's area, her field of study, and it's been an honor to have her come together with me to teach our students, because two great minds are better than one. So yeah.
Thanks. And in this particular workshop, we won't be doing any code, but what we're hoping, like Christian said, this does is kind of opens up a gateway for you to actually think, oh, maybe I do want to spend, a month trying to figure out how this R stuff works, right? That might actually be cool, perhaps after the election. So when we kind of try to detect or look for misinformation, oftentimes we do have to use these sort of computational data tools because there's an overwhelming amount of data, particularly on the internet, right? And so one of the ways in which we think about misinformation when we use data tools is thinking through how can we identify the traces that misinformation tends to leave on data. Perhaps if you're looking at bots, they leave certain kinds of timestamps, or they are only active during certain periods. Or if you're a Russian troll pretending to be an American citizen, you might have an IP address that's based in Russia as opposed to the US. And so a lot of our jobs when we're looking for misinformation is trying to use these data tools to find those traces. And as we know, programming languages can enhance our ability to identify this, but a lot of tools, I think, increasingly are trying to make it more accessible to people who are not traditional programmers. So just for a little bit of context before we dive into the tools themselves, a lot of the misinformation we're trying to identify in this workshop is really focused on digital misinformation. I tend to focus a lot on trying to detect misinformation across multiple social media platforms. And you'll see us talking about not just Facebook and Twitter, but some of the smaller alt-tech media platforms that you might be concerned about for the election. And just so folks understand how this sort of misinformation can spread, a lot of times misinformation might start on a smaller social media platform, such as Gab or Parler, then make its way into a more mainstream platform. Perhaps a user might have both a Gab account and then will create a Twitter account to post it, and we'll try to get that post elevated. They'll tell friends, please retweet this particular post with a piece of misinformation. And then in a more kind of panicky situation, sometimes that piece of misinformation from a social media platform ends up on a platform like Breitbart, for example, or a smaller digital platform, and then might make its way to a larger media platform. And so this process is typically called trading up the chain. Ryan Holiday has written quite extensively about this, and it's a process that is used both by kind of PR experts and advertisers, but increasingly we're seeing disinformation actors or folks who want to get their misinformation heard will exploit a very similar process, going from a smaller platform to a larger media outlet. And so what we're trying to do is identify them at these points, right? When they're moving up the chain, we don't want them to get to a point where they're on a national news organization getting reported and reaching a much wider audience. We want to catch them in these early stages before they even move up the chain. Some quick notes before we move on to the tools themselves. You are always welcome to interrupt me. If you have any questions at all, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, but if there's something along the process that is confusing, please feel free to interrupt me at any point. Secondly, the slides for this particular presentation are available. You'll notice I include them at the bottom right-hand corner for the next couple of slides, and so feel free to copy pasta that, or you'll see them further moving forward. And then finally, this workshop will demo about 4 different tools, 3 of which you can actually use as we're actively doing this workshop, and so please feel free to engage with me in this process. And if you see this particular sticker, this demo, that means that we're on a slide where we're demoing a particular tool. Yeah? Or questions? Okay. Excellent. Okay. So in thinking about how we use data to detect misinformation, I always like to think of this as a sequence. I think life is a lot easier when you can kind of program a set of steps to do something. So I like having routines in the morning. I like having certain things right before I start class. And similarly, when I'm detecting misinformation, I try to use a sequence of steps. And so, there we go. So the steps that I like to use are tracking, detecting, reporting. I'll spend a little bit talking about protecting, just protecting yourself as a journalist, what you can do when you're engaging in this work. And you'll notice that the slides that I'll walk through follow the exact same sequence. And so you'll notice this at the bottom right-hand corner. If you would just like to follow along, we'll start with some tracking tools, some detection tools, and then ultimately we'll talk a little bit about how to report with this sort of data information. So when I talk about tracking misinformation, I really mean what are the tools that I can use to find and kind of peruse for misinformation? How can I find these pieces of misinformation and then manage them in such a way that makes it easier to report that piece of information? And for this, there will be a variety of tools. And one thing that I'll note across all of these slides is that I'm kind of vomiting a lot of tools available right now to you. Some of those tools are free, and some of those tools require some subscription fee or something like that. And so if I kind of gloss over a particular tool that you're interested in, you're more than welcome to stop me and ask a little bit more about it. But the tools we'll talk about today in brief are SMAT, S-M-A-T, the Twitter API a little bit, Junkipedia, and then some paid social media tracking and listening tools. So those are DataMiner and NewsWhip. One area that doesn't quite get covered across these data tracking tools are kind of alt tech platforms. So a lot of these tools here really focus on mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter. But as I noted, a lot of these pieces of misinformation might start on smaller social media platforms. And so I wanted to actually make folks aware that these alt tech platforms are way more easily accessible than we think they are. I always had the kind of misconception that it would be really hard to get a Truth Social account, or really hard to get a Telegram account, or really hard to extract information from it. And in reality, they're actually quite easy, or you can do it in the click of a button. And so I listed a couple of platforms that you can actually tap into right now and collect data from directly from the platform. The first is 4chan. That's a really big source of misinformation, particularly for conspiracy theorists. The QAnon conspiracy theory often starts on 4chan or a platform such as 8kun. You might be somewhat anxious about actually going to the website itself. So one thing that I wanted to note is that there are a lot of folks who do archive that work and store it on a separate website, so you don't have to visit the more dangerous website. And 4plebes is one example of that. With Parler, Telegram, and Truth Social, you might have to provide some of your own information in order to get access to that website. So in the case of Parler, you have to use an email or a phone number. In Telegram and Truth Social, you have to provide a phone number. But all three of those platforms, there's usually some sort of button that allows you to actually export all of that data from a specific account or from a specific channel or group. And so all of these platforms, one, contain a fair amount of misinformation, and two, can be quite easy to gather data from. I do strongly recommend that if you're required to provide a phone number, to use like a Google phone number or something like that that can't ultimately be traced back to you. And so I wanted to kind of put this information out there so you're aware of the steps you would need to take if you wanted to collect data from these platforms. But it's kind of a pain, right? If I am listing like 4 social media platforms and you don't want to spend your morning going through each of these platforms trying to figure out what's in there. And so there are tools that kind of aggregate this sort of information that allow you to kind of see these things in trend. And one of those tools is called SMAT, S-M-A-T. And I like to talk about SMAT a lot, primarily because it's free. So that's one really big motivator for talking about it. It's publicly accessible and it's free. It contains a wide range of alt tech platforms. So most of the ones that I mentioned in the previous slide are available here for you to kind of query. But I'll note that it's a little bit tricky to identify the original post. So what SMAT is really good for is showing you trends. It'll show you if something kind of spiked in activity over time on a platform like Parler or Gab, but it might be a little trickier to pull out the data themselves. So SMAT, as I mentioned, is one of those tools that is free and publicly accessible. And if you just Google SMAT, you'll be probably taken to a query like this. And you can do this yourself. The website is smat-app.com. And this is what SMAT looks like in short form. So you'll notice at the very top, it contains a timeline of a specific piece of information. We can do QAnon. I can do, if I wanted to see kind of COVID discourse on a particular platform, I can see that over time. And then I can select the social media platform that I actually want to look at. And so if I'm concerned, maybe I see that there's a small piece of misinformation that someone I'm interviewing mentioned, I might want to trace back the original source of that misinformation piece. And I might dig through perhaps Gab or Parler in order to find this information. You'll notice on the left-hand side, yeah. Do you have an example search term in mind? Yeah. Not necessarily. That's okay.
I'm wondering, like, COVID's pretty broad, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody says something that's just sort of like particularly wacky, I mean, could you kind of just use the phrase and it would pop up?
Yes.
Could you like do COVID and, you know what I mean, like Boolean search?
Yes.
so that-
So you can do Boolean searches. You can do exact searches in quotation marks. So if you're looking for the exact phrase, save our children, or if you're looking for one of the pieces of misinformation I was trying to see here was monkeypox being related and vaccine. Let's see if that'll pop up. No. Let's see. So here, we're seeing instances where the term monkeypox and the term vaccine are being used. This particular piece of misinformation is related to the belief that the COVID vaccine caused the monkeypox. And so you can include multiple keywords. If I wanted to specifically type in like COVID vaccine, should be able to do that in quotes. So if you were looking for exact phrases, you can also do that here. Yeah,
When you did the COVID, monkeypox, vaccine,
yeah.
is that finding posts or like pieces of information that have both
Correct.
words? Okay.
Both of those words.
Okay.
So monkeypox and vaccine.
Got it. Okay.
If you were doing or, I would recommend you do the searches separately. So just a search for monkeypox and then a separate search for vaccine.
Thank you.
Yeah, great questions.
Can this take you to any posts themselves, or does it just show you how much it's being talked about?
So unfortunately, this only shows in the total number of posts, but I will say that their customer service / the team that creates this is really, really supportive when they work with journalists. And so if there were like 1,000 or 10,000 posts using this term and you wanted to get access to that data, I would encourage you to email them. And they're usually quite friendly when it comes to journalists, civic organizations, and those sort of folks. Yeah. One nice thing I'll note about this too is they always increase the number of social media websites that they're searching. And so when I started working with SMAT, they only had like Gab, Parler, 4chan. And so when I make a request like, oh, you know, it'd be really great if we had TikTok data, because I know a lot of folks are on TikTok, they do increasingly add more platforms. And so if there's a new platform that emerges that you want them to track, you can always reach out to them as well. And they're really quite resourceful when it comes to that. You can search for individual posts in some instances. Sorry, I don't know your names. Your name, sir? Matt, thank you. So to Matt's question about when you can find actual posts, you can't see the full totality of them. That's why you would have to email them. But you can see kind of examples of posts. So if you wanted to kind of pull out exemplar posts about, I'll just go back to COVID because there's a guarantee there's going to be posts related to that. You'll see some example posts, and they only show a maximum of 50, so it's not going to be representative and it's not going to be necessarily complete, but it'll kind of give you a taste of the type of discourse you would see. Yeah. So in general, I find SMAT to be really, really kind of intuitive. Yeah, sorry. No apologies.
So with something like COVID,
Yeah.
is that like they're saying like these are just all the mentions of COVID, or there's been like another filtering where they've identified this as misinformation? I'm
So
sorry,
this is all COVID information.
Okay. So just mentions of COVID.
Correct. These are all just right now just straight mentions of COVID. If you were looking for a specific type of misinformation,
Then
so
you would
for
add-
example, monkeypox and vaccine, I would have to narrow down my query in order to focus on monkeypox vaccine. And we'll walk through some tools that actually talk a little bit more about have just archives of misinformation. But this one is much more useful for if you have a piece of misinformation, how can I find it on other platforms? Yeah. But this is a tool you can start using now. Hopefully you're playing around with it on your computer. Another tool that I like to use, a lot of folks in this room mentioned that they have some familiarity with Twitter, and hopefully if you're in this room, you have access to Twitter or have a Twitter account. Chances are, journalists are the largest group of verified users on Twitter, and so most journalists have Twitter in some way. And if you have Twitter, it also means you have access to the Twitter API. And a lot of folks use Twitter, but not a lot of folks actually use the API to tap in and actually query and find information. And so I wanted to make folks aware that if you have a Twitter account, you can already access the API using their kind of lowest setting. This will allow you to collect, I believe, up to 5, well, in this case, the more kind of elevated version will allow you to collect up to 500,000 a month. I believe it starts with about 1,000 or 10,000. And if you request elevated access and indicate that you're a journalist, they give it to you for free, and you can elevate the amount of queries that you make. And so the API is really excellent for you to just collect a bunch of Twitter data. If you're concerned that a particular message has moved from one platform to another, this is one really easy way for you to collect it without using, they don't charge for accessing their API. And so if you haven't used APIs before, and if you're not sure what an API is, API stands for Application Programming Interface. And it's basically a tool that allows a user to tap into an archive or a database of another website. And so most social media platforms have an API that programmers can tap into. Facebook has an API, Twitter has an API, and in fact, most platforms have more than one API. So for example, Twitter has an API for just their advertising information, and then Twitter has an API for accessing all of the tweets that people on Twitter have ever posted. And so most APIs have varying levels of access. Twitter, because of how large it is, has 3 levels of access, but the 2 that most journalists use are essential and elevated. The third tool I want to talk about is Junkipedia. Similarly to Snat and to the Twitter API, it's a free tool. I really like it because it's really, really excellent for image analysis. So if you're interested in Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, it's really excellent for that. And it is specifically built for misinformation. And so sorry, I don't know your name. Someone had asked the question about, did Snat contain just misinformation or everything COVID? Yeah, India. So to India's question about which of these tools contain just misinformation and which of these tools contain everything, Junkipedia is specifically a tool that contains just misinformation. And so here they explicitly only track misinformation primarily of image social media platforms or video social media platforms, but they also contain Twitter and Facebook and other sorts of things. The third reason why I always talk about Junkipedia is because the creator of it, Cameron Hickey, is a really, really excellent source and goes way out of his way to help journalists. And so he himself is a former journalist, and he built this tool specifically to work with researchers, civic organizations, and other journalists. And so he's someone where anytime I have questions about Junkipedia, he's one of the most readily accessible individuals, and it's a big reason why I continue to use this tool. So I'm going to kind of just very quickly demo what Junkipedia looks like. I'll make a note that it's not possible for y'all to do it right now because you would have to apply for access. It normally takes about 48 hours to apply for access, so it's quite fast. And if you're interested in applying, you can actually click junkipedia.org/apply, and it's a fairly painless process. But just so that you can see what it looks like once you actually gain access, I wanted to walk you through the value of it. And so this is Junkipedia in a nutshell. As I note, they contain only pieces of misinformation. And so typically the way that you would provide a piece of information is to add a tip. So a tip is one individual piece of information. If you find something on the internet that you're concerned about, you can use the tips to store that information and archive it for yourself and make it readily accessible to others. But if you're looking for misinformation that other people have reported or have aggregated together, what you'll really be looking at are narratives and issues. Narratives are pieces of information. Sometimes they're aggregated together if you have multiple posts that relate to a similar topic. And then you'll also see information about the amount of engagement that it's received and the kinds of platforms that it has appeared on. And so if I click something like this, it'll give me some of the top themes or keywords. It'll give me a range of the reports themselves, what platforms that they end up on, and then it does also show the examples of posts and things themselves. Is
there some sort of feature that allows you to pin it geographically?
Great question. You might not, there isn't a feature per se. But what a lot of folks like to do is they like to add tags to all of their tips. And so you can tag geographic information that way. Yeah. So here, to your point, this person tagged Alaska, right? Because this piece of misinformation is specifically about Alaska, and these kind of group together. So here, below here, under the narrative issues, are the examples themselves, the specific examples. One thing I really like about Junkopedia is because they work specifically with misinformation and disinformation, they're very aware that this content can get deleted incredibly quickly. And so when you post a tip, the way that Junkopedia works is that it stores the website, the link itself, it reports it to Internet Archive so that it actually stores the URL, and then it takes a screenshot or a copy of the recording, so that if it does get lost, if the account gets deplatformed or suspended, you still retain that piece of misinformation if you have to report on it afterwards. When it comes to issues, I think of them as pieces of misinformation. And so in this kind of issues section, you'll notice that they're individual posts or individual messages. And so Junkopedia increasingly has started to support non-English languages. So you'll see a lot of the more higher up posts are in not English because they're starting to provide support for not English languages. And anything that you kind of report yourself will end up under my issues. So all issues are everything that everyone reports, and my issues are things that I reported or found pieces of misinformation specifically. And so this is a particular post that I had found on YouTube of an event that was occurring in Texas. This is a QAnon-linked event called the For God and Country Patriot Roundup, where Michael Flynn somewhat infamously mentioned that what happened in Myanmar should happen here. I wanted to save those YouTube videos. They get deleted very quickly, and so I was using Junkopedia to serve that role. So it doesn't just help you detect misinformation, but if you find misinformation that you want to save, Junkopedia is really, really useful for that.
So it saves it on your dashboard pretty much, even
Yes.
if it's deleted from YouTube?
Yes, it does. It saves it on your dashboard. It saves it to the link to Internet Archive, and then it downloads the video or the image for you. Yeah, so that's a really big thing, right? If the tweet or something gets deleted, how do you actually go back and retrieve it? And it doesn't only just do that for you. How you access the other issues are also because when someone else reports this particular post, that also gets stored. So that's how you're able to see other people's misinformation posts. Yeah. And as I mentioned, if you look at the narrative, so going back to this example on ranked choice, they account for a variety of platforms, and so it doesn't really matter if you're finding misinformation on Twitter or Truth Social or Getter or something like that. There is support on Junkopedia to store that. And they specialize in social media misinformation, and so the tip, you can actually tip like a website or something like that. But if it's a social media platform, they go through the process of actually identifying the post or the video there.
When you submit a tip, is it automatically flagged as misinformation?
Yes. So the expectation is that when you submit a tip that it's a piece of misinformation. You can notate in like a tag or something that this is not a piece of misinformation or it's tangential, but the purpose of this particular tool is for storing and retrieving and archiving misinformation.
So it can't just be used to archive any tweet that may disappear, basically.
Correct, yes. Although at the very end when we talk about reporting on misinformation, I'll talk a little bit more about Internet Archive, and that's how I typically like to store tweets or videos or things like that. Yeah.
Hey, Joe, question about that. So if it immediately marks it as misinformation, couldn't bad actors go into Junkopedia and use that as a way to like mark things that are not misinformation? As misinformation? I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm a bad person for thinking of that.
No, it's great that you asked that. And that's why Junkopedia is not like a freely accessible tool.
Right. So
That's
you
why.
have to be legitimized
Yes.
that you're not.
Yes, you have to apply, you have to indicate the organization. Cameron Hickey and his team cull through the applications and will reject them if you're not a genuine organization. Yes. And so unlike a lot of the other tools that I show, will be tools that are publicly accessible. This is not specifically because Cameron Hickey only focuses on researchers, civic organizations, and journalists. And so you have to be in one of those 3 categories to get access to Junkopedia. But it is free.
Is this only in for English, or could you use it if you saw something in Spanish or another language? And would there be a different way of archiving it because of that?
There is not a different way of archiving it because of that. You can, I don't know why I'm using this. You can collect things in non-English, and one thing that Cameron has been doing a much bigger job on, especially with the lead up to the 2020 election, is trying to do either optical character recognition or machine translation on non-English tools. And so you'll notice here, there's something in Mandarin Chinese, and so they do store this information. I don't think they translate it, but they do make it, you can store it, they convert the image into text and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Quickly, sorry.
No apologies.
That YouTube clip, the way you got it to save on your dashboard, did you submit it as a tip first?
Yes.
Okay, and then
It'll pop up under, you see it's under my issues, so this is something that I have specifically flagged or put in as a tip. All issues is stuff that other folks have put up. And then if you wanted to submit a tip, you would just go to the Add Tip button. You would put in the link. You would describe the problem so that folks get a little bit of context. You can tag, so the location flag here, that's what would appear in the tag, like Alaska or Louisiana or something like that. And then you can upload an image or a screenshot, but if you don't, that'll automatically just scrape it from the website that you indicated. Yeah, so I didn't actually upload the video itself. I just put in the link and they pulled the video for me. Great questions. Other questions about Junkopedia? Yeah.
Oftentimes they're pretty pressed on deadlines, so do you have an example of using this, when you've got a breaking story and showing how someone used this and then what the story was that they did?
Yeah, I don't have an example offhand. I can try to pull one together for you. I'll ask Cameron for a specific example. So I don't do as much breaking news stories. A lot of what I do is I'll use this to kind of archive the information, and if I need to write a report on it, I'll use the link from Junkopedia to store that.
Not necessarily breaking, but just an enterprise story you do in a couple of days, but something where you can just show, we got a tip, we went to this, then it produced this story.
Yeah, I can cull through. I don't write a lot of kind of feature stories myself, but I'm sure there are examples, and I can bring that back to Talia, who can share it with you.
Yeah, and I can send an email out afterward or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that case in the sense of that connection of monkeypox and vaccine, where we're trying to debunk or explain that, and Joe will get into the truth sandwich of the best way to explain that, and then using this to find examples of how that was spread on different platforms. I could totally see how that would work. Now, that's still dependent on that people have already submitted those issues to be there. So it's like one place of many that you would need to look to find examples to bolster your story.
And that's a really great point. A lot of these tools, because the internet has gotten really unwieldy and complicated, what we've realized is that you need kind of a collection of tools in order to do something. And so oftentimes Junkopedia isn't just used in singularity. You might be combining Junkopedia, a tip or something, look it up in SNAT, find that it's actually living on another social media platform, and then ultimately report on the fact that it's moving across platforms.
Hey Joe, I sort of have an example. I mean, I didn't do a story about this, but when I was searching myself, I found some stuff that I think you could. Like I was looking for monkeypox and gay, and I found all these examples of how conservative media was taking the White House statement about monkeypox predominantly affecting gay male population and distorting it. So if you were doing a story that was saying like, hey, Americans, there is a risk of monkeypox. Yes, it's predominantly in this population, but that doesn't mean it doesn't get to anyone else. You could easily find like actual news stories from that. And the other thing you could find in there is there was a case where some dogs got monkeypox, and the misinformation was saying that people were having sex with dogs, which they were not. The dogs just spread it. So I could see if you were trying to debunk that, you could easily find examples, from like the Blaze and things like that, that you'd be able to say, here's where they distorted an actual White House statement to do it. So just one example.
Yeah. And that's actually, I just wanted to dig around and see if they happen to have a narrative about that. And I don't necessarily see one, but I'm sure there is probably a narrative involving this kind of monkeypox
Yeah, I mean, when I
stuff too.
searched, there's a ton of stuff came up.
Yeah.
Is there, so I don't know what the monitor button up there or the monitor tab, but is there a way where they track something that is going like explosively viral that you may want to jump onto? I guess you can't get ahead of it if it's already viral, but to try to get to that earlier than you normally may have, or would you use SMAT and Junkipedia together to kind of do that?
I would use SMAT and Junkipedia together to find where it is. So Junkipedia might have a tip. If something has gone viral, it would have been stored in Junkipedia. And then if I wanted to see, did it actually start on the TikTok video that Junkipedia stored, or did it actually start on Parler? And I would use SMAT in order to identify kind of the original source of that. Yeah. In terms of monitoring specifically, this tool will allow you to monitor individual users or accounts. And so if there are specific people that you are concerned might go viral or might spread a piece of misinformation, Junkipedia will allow you to actively monitor those accounts. And so that's what that monitor tab is for. You'll notice up here it says import your CrowdTangle list. I don't know if folks have access to CrowdTangle. It's a tool that comes from Meta and allows you to query Facebook and Instagram. But if you do use CrowdTangle, you can directly import that, and it'll just monitor all of the accounts that are listed in your CrowdTangle tool. Yeah. Did I miss a question from someone? Yeah.
So with SMAT, does it also like monitor private groups on Facebook?
Unfortunately not.
Okay.
Yeah. And all of these tools, because of the strict terms of service for both, not just Facebook, but most social media platforms, you can't check people's DMs, you can't check private messages, you can't check private groups, and you can't check secret groups, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm trying to think through, like, especially when you want to find, like, if it's possible to find, like, an original poster or, like, a near original poster. So would you maybe you'd see a tip in Junkipedia, or maybe this had already gone viral, and then you could use that to see.
To trace back.
Yeah, to see, like, where was, like, the first spike.
Exactly.
And then if you wanted to find that person, though, would you then see, did anyone submit a tip on Junkipedia? And then if it wasn't there, do you think, like the customer service people at SMAT would be able to, like, help you locate, like...
Yeah, thinking through the use case of it. So if I were very specifically, if I found a piece of misinformation and I wanted to trace it back, so say I found the tip on Junkipedia, I would use SMAT and look back in time, and if I couldn't find the original post because SMAT has a 50 message maximum, I would decrease my time frame. And so, for example, if it's from, if the first post looks like it got viral on February 2nd, I might just move my SMAT search time frame for February 2nd to February 4th in a way that forces it to be under 50 posts. Then I could find the original post. Then I could save that post to Junkipedia as a tip, right? Because I don't want that post to get deleted, so that when I'm actually writing the story, I can embed the actual message in there. Mm-hmm. Great questions.
When you're doing that example you just suggested, are you also sourcing Junkipedia when you put that image in there that's been saved?
Yes. Yep.
On the search, kind of back to his original question,
Yeah.
can you search, like when you put the location tags on the tips, can you search just Texas or Wisconsin, or to kind of narrow that down?
Yes. So if I wanted to specifically look for pieces of misinformation about Texas, I could search it in this kind of search bar up here, and it'll search the full range of topics. It'll search all the platforms that you would want, and it is ordered by the most recent to the oldest. Yep. And this search will search both the tags as well as the information in the narrative. So if the word Texas appears as a tag, or if the word Texas appears as one of the words in the narrative, it'll pop up as a result.
When you first brought this up, when we were talking about Alaska for a minute there, the first thing that popped up did not have a tag of Alaska, but it was in the headline, so
Right.
that would still show.
Exactly, that would still show up.
That's under narrative. Okay.
Yep, that's under narrative. I believe under issues, you should also see a search function at top. So you can also search individual posts. I wanted to look for Alaska. Here's a whole slew of Alaska-specific pieces of misinformation. Yeah.
So, I'm having trouble
That's okay.
distinguishing the difference between the narratives and the issues.
Yeah, so a narrative is a group of issues. So if there's multiple posts making the same claim, you can group them as a narrative. Is that helpful?
And then the issues is just one single post.
Individual posts, yeah. That way, if you like had a piece of misinformation and someone had happened to put in a tip for both, you know, misinformation on Telegram and misinformation on TikTok, you could store them together as a narrative. And so when you search for narratives, you're searching for groups of issues with the same claim.
And it can be across platforms.
Correct. It can be across platform. And in fact, that's one of the major advantages of looking at narratives. So if I looked at this beta or work claim.
Oh, I see. The user put that title in there. Okay.
Yes, the user put the title in here. This is the description that the person has provided. You can edit and actively engage with it, but they don't approve the edits until someone else has reviewed them. And then you'll notice here, issue by platform, there's 3 pieces of issues that have been placed in this narrative. One is from Rumble, one from YouTube, and one from Twitter.
So I mean, I imagine you would start with narratives. Why would you want to look just for one single issue or one single post?
So sometimes if it's a fairly new piece of misinformation, you might only have a narrative with just one issue, right? And when you are posting a tip, the tip automatically becomes an issue. So here I've added one tip and it automatically becomes one issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, the other reason why you might want to only look at specific posts is because each post has its own engagement metrics. So when you go to narratives, the metrics that are provided here are an aggregation of all of the issues that have been posted in here. Yeah, good questions. Yeah.
Do any of these tools allow you to basically follow a particular user across platforms?
That's what monitoring is for. So you can use Monitor to follow a specific account. If you use CrowdTangle, you can import your whole list. So if you had 20 accounts on CrowdTangle, you can import that directly in here. And you can also follow anything that they've listed as public. So these are specific Facebook pages that contain misinformation. Okay. Awesome. Oh, I always do that. Okay. Other data tracking tools that I think are worth highlighting, but I don't go through them nearly as extensively because they are paid tools, include Data Miner and NewsWhip. So Data Miner is more a tool that is useful for tracking social media specifically. It's very similar to Junkipedia in that it's kind of aggregating multiple social media platforms. It contains a lot more data compared to Junkipedia or SMAT, but obviously it costs a fair bit of money. NewsWhip is useful for tracking the spread of news stories specifically, including information that gets traded up the chain. So if there's a piece of misinformation that I find on Junkipedia and I look at SMAT and see how much has it spread or has it gotten bigger on a specific platform over time, I might then head over to NewsWhip and see if like a smaller digital platform has picked it up as a news story. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, one of the things about Data Miner, you were asking earlier about geographic locations. Data Miner will use if there's geographic information of the poster available, you can like geofence an area and collect that. So if you wanted to look at information just for Austin, then you'd be able to do that if I remember correctly. You were shaking your head, so yeah. It's been a while since I used Data Miner. Yeah.
Okay, so now that we know some tools about where to like query things, how to use SMAT and Junkipedia, I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens when you've actually found the piece of information, when you're looking for the piece of misinformation. One thing that I wanted to note is that there's a lot of different varieties of misinformation, and so when we tend to think of misinformation, we assume it means a very specific message or claim. Yesterday, y'all learned quite a bit about deepfakes, so you know that a lot of images when they're doctored also constitutes misinformation. And the last type of misinformation I wanted to point out were users. So when there is a user who is lying about their identity, or they're a bot and they're pretending to be a genuine person, we consider that also to be a piece of misinformation. And when we find a piece of misinformation, I do think it's worth taking the time to look at the author of the post and see if that person is a single spreader of misinformation or have they repeatedly been doing this over time, right? So for me, it's not sufficient to just find the piece of misinformation. I might find another story in digging back to their prior posts. There's a lot of different tools for detecting misinformation, and I won't be able to go through all of them, but I do list a couple specifically for images, and then we'll talk a little bit about this tool down here, Bottometer. So for doctored images, these are tools, I believe both of them are paid tools, for identifying posts or images that have been doctored. So photo forensics at the top is great for still images. So if you have a piece of a post or a screenshot that you are concerned might be fake, photo forensics is really excellent for that. That's for still images. And then if you're concerned about detecting or identifying deepfakes, this tool, Deepware, allows you to plug in a specific video, and it'll try to detect if that video has been manipulated or if they can see the seams of the head. If someone has replaced someone else's head, it's going to try to look specifically for the seams between the head and the neck. So for video, Deepware is really excellent. For images, specifically like screenshots and things like that, photo forensics is where you want to go. Another tool that might be useful once you have detected this piece of image misinformation might be TinEye. And so TinEye is a competitor to Google reverse image search. Both of them are really excellent tools for kind of scouring the internet and looking for where this image has been posted elsewhere. And so if you do detect a piece of misinformation in an image, you might go to TinEye to see how far back or where that image has been posted elsewhere. I had to do this recently because a lot of misinformation right now is spread in screenshot form. So what's happening right now is a lot of misinformation actors are kind of copying and pasting BBC's website, writing a new news story, and then pretending that BBC reported this fake story. I would use something like photo forensics in order to identify that the image has been manipulated because the text has been added in from a screenshot. And then I would use TinEye to do a reverse image search and see if other places have posted using that particular screenshot. Then I would put it on Junkipedia and then store it to make sure that if it gets deleted, I would still be able to write that story. The last tool that I'll go over is Bottometer. I also, again, recommend it because it's free. I'm all about free tools and making things easier. The way that Bottometer works is that it's built on top of the Twitter API. And so you cannot detect bots that are in other social media platforms, unfortunately. This is specifically a tool that allows you to identify bots on a Twitter platform specifically. And it's really useful for studying whether a user is a bot or not, right? That's the function of Bottometer, is to detect whether someone is a bot or when someone is not a bot. And it uses a range of mechanisms in order to do so. So here on the right-hand side, you'll see two examples of this. The one at the top is SMNP, which explicitly states that they're a bot. And you'll notice when I put that name in Bottometer, it gives me a rank of 4.2 out of 5. So I can be reasonably confident that this is a bot. Down here, I've included Talia's social media profile. And as you can see, she is very much not a bot. She is a totally genuine, real human being. And you're welcome to include your own username to see if you would be identified as a bot or not. I'll note that this tool is not absolutely perfect, right? These are machine learning tools that use a combination of information to try to estimate whether an account is a bot. So some of the things that they specifically look at are, for example, whether a user posts at like 9 a.m. on the dot every single day. That's pretty not standard for a human to do, but it's quite typical for a bot to do. They might also look at the broader network of that particular account, so they'll see if other accounts are likely to be bots. And if you're following a lot of bots, they might increase or assume that you are more likely to be a bot. This tool, as I note, is publicly accessible. So if you just go to Bottometer, it was a tool developed by a team in Indiana, and you can just type in, I'll just use mine. Oh, and it'll ask for authorization. As I mentioned, it kind of, I should have done this, sorry about that, folks. It'll use your Twitter API in order to access that. I might not do it right now, but if you are playing around with it, I encourage you to kind of go through the process of getting it verified. You'll get this sort of marker here. And this information here is what you would see on this slide. So for each individual user, you would get this sort of information and why they've been tagged as a bot or not. You can also use this tool to look for their group of followers. So you'll notice that in the tool Botometer, they also had a check followers or check friends. So if you are not particularly concerned about account, but you're concerned that their friends or their followers are all bots, you can also use Botometer to search for that.
And this may seem obvious, but on the far right, what it's giving you like your likelihood that of bots, right? If you're in the red zone, it's
Yes.
high bot, right? And
Yes.
the blue zone, you're in the clear.
Yes, thank you. And it gives you a score from 0 to 5. So the closer you are to 5, the higher the likelihood that you're a bot. And as I mentioned, they do search for a variety of pieces of information. So they might see if do you have a lot of fake followers? Or do you have a lot of users that you're just retweeting and that are retweeting you? That's what the term echo chamber means. Or are you posting a lot of spam that can be detected across all of Twitter? Okay. And then finally, we talked a little bit about detecting misinformation. We talked a little bit about scouring the internet for misinformation. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is ultimately, once you find this piece of information, how do you report on it? And my recommendation is always to use what's called a truth sandwich. I found this term from Pointer when I was doing another workshop with them, and they describe it as kind of sandwiching the piece of false information between two truthful pieces of information. So you might start with the context of a story, then you provide the false claim, and then you end with the correction. And in theory, this is supposed to ensure that when you are reporting on a piece of misinformation, none of your readers are looking at it and being like, oh, I believe that piece of misinformation, right? Because you've sandwiched it now between two truthful comments, and you've made it very explicit that the piece of information you're reporting on is false. And so that's the kind of process that I like to use when I'm actually writing the story on a piece of misinformation. Oh. Yeah?
So this is really useful, but very challenging in a headline. How would you suggest handling that in a headline?
Sandwich.
Pardon?
The sandwich she's talking
Yeah. I'll have to think about that a little bit. The way that I would probably do it kind of as a gut response to your question is starting with the term false claim or something in the beginning, and then providing some context for the piece of information, right? Like false claim about something found on XYZ platform. So I would probably start by emphasizing this part of the truth sandwich in a headline would be the term false claim or a false, report was found on something. Yeah.
Just add to that example, we did a study where we looked across Facebook at what headlines people were using from fact-checking organizations and then surveyed people within 24 hours afterward to ask them what they learned from that fact check. And when you did say exactly what Joe's saying, like, it is not true that, or false claim, people remembered it far better than just asserting the truth or asking a question.
Sometimes in fact-checking stories, you might see the term false used at the end, and I would strongly recommend that you want to put that right up front, or else someone might miss it.
If you were reporting specifically on the actor who spread that you could be like, so-and-so, falsely claims, or I don't even know if you want to put the claim itself, but like,
maybe you're focusing on the user. Yeah.
Submitted a false claim about X issue or whatever like that.
Yeah. And especially if they're a repeat offender, right? Someone who repeatedly spreads false information, I might even go so far as to describe them as, so-and-so person who repeatedly spreads false information has now posted yet another piece of misinformation. The other thing that I think is really important, in addition to just reporting, is also making sure you store this information. Because as we've just talked about, this sort of misinformation from social media very quickly disappears from the platform. And so it's really important to me that folks are engaging in the process of storing the data itself. And so after you've written the story, or perhaps as you're writing the story, I strongly recommend a couple of different things in order to make sure you have multiple places to access the data. The first, if you have a piece of misinformation, you want to save it to your computer so you have a local copy. That might be taking a screenshot or downloading the YouTube video from the internet just to have in your hard drive in case all else fails. The other two places I like to do, or the other two things I like to do, is to archive the posts themselves. So the first one is Junkipedia. You all learned about that when you're adding tips. Junkipedia will store them, they'll screenshot them and store the video. The other place I like to go to is Internet Archive. And some folks indicated that they're aware of Internet Archive and are aware of how to use the Wayback Machine to look in the past. But I really like to emphasize that Internet Archive is also really excellent for storing links that might ultimately get deleted. And so there are quite a few situations where I've gone to the Internet Archive, there's a tweet that someone's posted and I'm concerned it's going to be deleted. I'll put it on the Internet Archive and I'll use the Internet Archive link in my story as opposed to using the original story. That way it won't get disconnected. And then I think this is really important because if I find a piece of misinformation, I'm very likely to report it. I don't want that piece of misinformation to stick around, right? And so with the QAnon covers that I was looking at previously, I ended up reporting all of the YouTube videos because I didn't want those pieces of misinformation floating around, knowing that they were going to be deleted, right? And so that's why these kind of archiving processes are really essential, because by the time you report it, then it will get deleted, and you want to make sure you have those copies. We talked already a little bit about Junkipedia and submitting a tip, so you can always click that Add Tip button or click Submission New, and it'll kind of take you through the process where you would link the post, describe it, add the location, as well as other tags. And then with Internet Archive, it's fairly easy to do this process. If you go to Web Archive, at the very bottom, there's just a Save Page Now button. And so y'all might have been, using the Wayback Machine to search for things, but it'll automatically save pages as well. And if you create a Internet Archive account, you can actually go back and see all of the posts or all of the pages that you've saved in the past. One thing I'll note about Internet Archive, it's really excellent for storing static pages, for blog posts, Twitter posts, images, things like that. It's less great for video, and so it takes quite a bit of time for Internet Archive. If you have like a YouTube video or something like that, it might save the YouTube page, but it might not necessarily save the video itself because of how much storage video takes. And so that's why I also mentioned Junkipedia, because Junkipedia will absolutely save the video, whereas Internet Archive might save the page, but it won't save the video.
So do you save it in
Both.
Do you always do it?
Yes. Yep. I always save it in both, and that's doubly true for video. If if there's like a claim or a post that I want to go back to, but I don't think it's necessarily rises to the level of misinformation, I might save it on Internet Archive. And Internet Archive is not misinformation specific, obviously, and so there are a lot of situations where if it's not misinformation per se, but it's like, an exaggerated claim or hyperbole, I might still save it on Internet Archive, but I might not put it up on Junkipedia.
Does it track changes to a website?
Yes.
Because the big story now, like in Florida, has been some of the Republican candidates are switching, they're taking away the abortion issue from their pages because it's gotten so hot. And they're either burying it on their webpage or moving around. So can you track when a campaign gets launched, they launch a webpage, and then does it, or do you have to monitor it manually? Like go in and go find it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So the way that Internet Archive works is that it'll store just for that particular day, and it aggregates it for that page. For some pages with an elevated risk, they will repeatedly take screenshots or basically archive it so that you can look back in the past. And if a site is particularly high risk, there's a higher likelihood that other users are reporting it. You can also ask Internet Archive to repeatedly collect from a particular website if you're concerned for something like changing like that. I use this particular link because it's what I've been currently studying, this QAnon event, and the event changes over time. So the one that I was studying was in Dallas. They had since organized an event in Vegas. And so if you look at the 2020 content or the snapshots from 2020, you will see it refer to the Vegas event or the latest event. if I went backwards in time and I looked at some of their earlier posts in 2020, this is how I go back and try to find the earlier iteration of that post. So the way that this site works is every time they have a new event, they totally change their website. And so I can't use the current Patriot Voice website. I have to go back in the Wayback Machine. This is a very long-winded answer to basically say yes. If you wanted to have repeat copies and you're trying to find a situation where someone has changed the website and you want to look at the previous copy and compare it to the current one, you should be able to do so if someone has stored that image.
There are a couple of paid services too that will consistently track a page for you and alert you when there's a change and save it. I think Trackly
Yeah.
I think is the one we use. It's like $10 or $20 a month. And so we follow certain pages and track them, and it will alert you to a change.
Internet Archive won't alert you to it, so a tool like Trackly would be really, really helpful because of the alert specifically. Internet Archive would only be able to compare pre and post. Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to know on the Internet Archive, it's inconsistent in this way, but we had a lot of luck once we were doing an investigation on a particular company, and we were able to go back in the archive, and the archive had actually captured prior sales reports, like presentations that, and some of them were available, some of them it did not capture. I don't really know the technical how it works, but it was a aspect of this that we hadn't considered before, and we were able to get kind of past statements on things that were no longer available that really highlighted the investigation pretty nicely. So just something to like, you can sometimes, if it's scanning a site frequently, you can sometimes mine pretty far within the archived pages.
And on the flip side of that, some cases, an old page might, what the Internet Archive captures is links to the information that are on servers, and when those servers shut down, that part of that page may no longer be available.
Yep.
So the text might be there, but things like
The
images
formatting.
and JavaScript calls and stuff like that might not be there.
Does that same thing happen with Junkipedia, or does it?
So Junkipedia doesn't crawl through the links the way that Internet Archive does. When Internet Archive stores a piece of information, they try to, the code tries to click all the links on that particular page and store that as well, so that when you do want to go back, it's not a pure, perfect success, because what they're doing is kind of spidering through all of the URLs. Internet Archive does do that. Junkipedia does not. Junkipedia just stores the particular image, message, or video. Yeah. Other questions? Let's go back. Oh. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about before we close up is the general process of protecting yourself. And I think when folks are engaging in reporting on this, or when you're doing any research on this, you do incur a bit of risk, right? And you're putting your name out there as someone who studies this or someone who's reporting on this. And so I do think it's really, really important to think about how you protect yourself, both from a security perspective, but also from a mental health perspective. And so it is really important to keep aware that brigading and doxing do exist. These are practices that antagonists might use to try to identify your personal information, or might try to harass you both online and offline. And so I do think it's really important when you're going through the process of reporting on misinformation that you remove yourself from people search sites, things like kind of yellow pages, but online. You want to make sure that your name isn't on those places, so that when someone's looking you up, they're not finding your home address, they're not finding your phone number, and that sort of thing. If you have this slide deck, you'll be able to link to this, and this link is a list of people search sites that you can you can request that your name and information be removed from those pages. And then, of course, you want to be careful about the information you provide. Yeah?
With those people search sites, and I've done this myself, but you can also...
Somebody could track your family members. That's harder to remove a person that's not you, correct?
Yes, it is harder to remove a person that's not you. When I do this sort of work, when I removed myself from the people search sites, I reached out to my brother and I asked him to do the same. And I noticed that my siblings tend to have a much larger internet presence than my parents do. And so I couldn't find my parents' information. And one thing that I would recommend if you're concerned about that is these people search sites, like most people can use as well. And so I would encourage you to just check to see if your family members are listed on there. And if they are, then you can reach out to the person in your family and ask them to kind of go through a similar process. So it's harder for you to get someone else's information removed, but you can tell that person and they can go through that process.
I just wanted to add too, there are also subscription sites that will do that searching and removal for you. Delete Me is one that we recommend to folks a lot as well.
Yeah, and I'll also note that these people search sites kind of vary in what they're willing to remove, and so some of them it's as simple as filling out a form and getting it removed. Sometimes they might ask for identifying information, and you might have a longer back and forth. Some of them, unfortunately, require you to pay to get that information removed, and so there's a bit of a range in terms of what you need to do in order to get your information removed from those pages. But it's an important process, especially as you're thinking about I don't want to be harassed for the kind of reporting or stories that I write. And then finally, just as important, I think, as security is the mental health that you might incur when you're consuming this sort of content. This is especially true if you're reporting on minority populations, because there's a noticeable intersection between misinformation and pro-violence or racist content. And so you'll notice on Junkipedia, it's a combination of misinformation as well as pro-violence content when people are planning and organizing second insurrections and other controversial violent events, that all of those things kind of intersect. And so you really want to be careful as you're doing this sort of work that you're protecting yourself mental health-wise. And so if you don't have a therapist, I strongly encourage it. I'm not going to go at great lengths for it, but I do think it's really important, when you are doing this sort of misinformation, that you take breaks from social media, that you talk to other folks about it, and that you find ways to commiserate in healthy, perhaps non-alcoholic forms. And I will end it with a couple of final thoughts. So we've gone through quite a few data tools, right? We've talked about Junkipedia, we've talked about Internet Archive, SNAT, and I think they're really great. And I think over time, we've had more people try to build these sort of data tools that don't require you to do any code. But if you really want to take your misinformation detection to the next level, it is super, super helpful to know a programming language such as R or Python. And so those tools like Botometer or Junkipedia, that's all built on code, right? That someone had to go through the process, whether it's Cameron Hickey or Christian or myself. It's much easier to kind of write that into code than it is to go through the website and have I wish I could do something on the website, but the website doesn't allow me to do it. Right? Code allows you to do the things that you want to do. And so a lot of the tools we talk about are built on these sort of programming languages. And if you want to take your misinformation detection to the next level, I encourage you to consider looking into learning R or Python. And as Christian kind of noted in the beginning of the presentation, there are a lot of tools that allow you online that are free tutorials that allow you to learn R and Python. One thing I'll also note is over the past 5 years, I've noticed an increase in tutorials and services that provide R and Python specifically for journalists, right? And so I don't think it's sufficient to just take any old Python intro tutorial. I think it's really helpful to learn a Python intro tutorial specifically for journalists. And I think there are way more of those resources than there used to be 5 years ago.
We host the Knight Center for the Americas here, and they have online training courses. And they have one by Andrew Bautran of the Washington Post of using R for journalism. His material is already online, and they're hosting a new one soon that is the second part of that course. So if you do have if you took that before or you have some more skills, that's a good one to use. R for the rest of us isn't journalism specific, but I like the way that he approaches that. So. That Sharon Mackless of PC World is another journalist who does a lot of training for journalists. NICAR, the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, is an arm of IRE, the Investigative Reporters and Editors. Go to that conference. Go. Just go. Just go. It is brilliant, and it's 1,500 of the best journalists in the world teaching other people all their secrets. Because we don't compete on code, we compete on stories. And we're happy to share our methods because we want, an example of that is the Washington Post taking all that Arcos data, lots of money 3 years of court records to get, a record of every opioid pill sold in America, and then they just gave it away. And they made an API so that you could do it, do local stories. So that's the kind of attitude that, the technical journalists, that intersection of technology and journalism, this open sourceness that we want to share how we do things, so that others can do the great work that we all want to do.
And as you can tell, Christian and I are both kind of geeky, right? Like we're just big nerds. And I think that really speaks broadly to the community of data journalists in general. They're just big nerds who really want to talk a lot about data and code. And NICAR does have a bunch of workshops specifically. And so I, again, will kind of echo Christian's comment about attending NICAR. Even if you don't know, a darn thing about code, you can attend the workshops to learn it and kind of give you a point of contact so that if something goes terribly wrong with your code, you have someone to reach out to.